When Mom suggested we take the weekend trip to the Dhaka, I thought it would be an escape from the chaos of the city, a chance to unwind and recharge. The house out there was old and creaky, but I loved it. It smelled like pine wood and carried the kind of silence you could sink into, far removed from the constant noise of daily life. Mark, my stepfather, was enthusiastic about it, as he always was. He liked fixing things, and the dacha gave him plenty of excuses to tinker with broken hinges, leaky pipes, or the rusted tools in the garage. He'd been in our lives for about 6 years now, ever since he and Mom got married. Mark was dependable, calm, and always willing to lend a hand. At least, that's what I used to think. The drive to the dacha was uneventful. Mom sat in the passenger seat, chatting about how she couldn't wait to sleep in the hammock with a book. I sat in the back, headphones in, scrolling through TikTok and zoning out. Mark occasionally glanced at me in the rearview mirror, smiling the way he always did. But this time, there was something about his smile that made my stomach twist, though I couldn't explain why. We arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink. Mark pulled the car into the driveway, parked, and hopped out. "I'll grab the heavy stuff," he said, popping the trunk. I followed him around to the back of the car and reached for one of the bags, but he stopped me. "Leave it. You can take the smaller ones," he said, his tone firm but light. I shrugged and grabbed a small bag before heading toward the house. The key was under the flower pot, exactly where it always was. "Wait, Hannah," Mark called out. I turned to see him holding the toolbox. "Can you help me in the garage for a second?" "Sure," I said, setting the bag down on the porch. The garage smelled just like I remembered, like sawdust, old oil, and metal. Mark set the toolbox on the workbench and started rummaging through it. I leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "What do you need help with?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately, his back to me as he sifted through the tools. Finally, he turned around, holding a flashlight. "Could you hold this for a second?" he asked, his tone casual. "Sure," I said, taking the flashlight from him. As I fiddled with the switch, I heard the soft click of the door behind me. I turned to see Mark locking it. My heart skipped a beat. "Why did you lock the door?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just so we're not interrupted," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, and I took a step back. "Interrupted from what?" He chuckled softly, leaning against the workbench. "Relax, Hannah. You're acting like I've got some kind of sinister plan." "Well, it's weird," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound calm. Mark tilted his head, studying me. "You've been distant lately," he said, his tone dropping slightly. "You don't talk to me the way you used to." "I've just been busy," I said quickly. "School's been hectic." "That's not it," he said, taking a step closer. I backed away instinctively, my back hitting the shelves behind me. "You avoid me," he continued, his voice soft but insistent. "You don't even look at me anymore. Did I do something to upset you?" "No," I said, my voice shaking. I don't know. I think we should go back inside." Mark's expression darkened for a moment, but then he stepped back, holding up his hands. "Fine," he said. "Let's go inside." So I didn't tell Mom what had happened. How could I? She was so happy to be at the dacha, so relaxed for the first time in weeks. I didn't want to ruin her weekend over something that, in hindsight, I could convince myself wasn't that big of a deal. But it was a big deal. That night, as I lay in bed in the small upstairs room, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. The way he'd locked the door, the way his voice shifted, the way he looked at me. It wasn't normal. I told myself I was overthinking it. Mark was my stepfather. He cared about me. He loved Mom. I was just being paranoid. But the pit in my stomach wouldn't go away. The next day, I tried to avoid him as much as possible. I stayed in the house, helping Mom clean and organize while Mark worked on fixing the gutters. Every time I saw him, my chest tightened, and I found an excuse to leave the room. By the afternoon, Mom had fallen asleep in the hammock, and I sat on the porch with a book. Mark came around the corner, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hey," he said, his tone light. "Hi. I said, forcing a smile. Can you help me with something in the garage again? He asked, his gaze steady. My stomach twisted. I'm busy, I said, holding up the book. It'll only take a minute, he said, his smile faltering slightly. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Maybe later. He stared at me for a moment, his jaw tightening before nodding. All right, he said, walking away. That evening, after Mom had gone to bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. Hannah? Mark's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I froze, my chest tightening. What? Can we talk? No, I said quickly, my voice trembling. There was a long pause, and then the sound of his footsteps retreating. I didn't sleep that night. The morning after the knock on my door, I woke up feeling as if I hadn't slept at all. My eyes were heavy, and my chest still ached from the fear that had kept me awake most of the night. The sound of Mark's footsteps retreating had played over and over in my mind, each echo feeding the unease gnawing at me. I climbed out of bed and pulled on a sweater, hoping the chilly morning air outside would help me shake the lingering dread. Mom was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she cooked breakfast. Good morning, sweetheart, she said, glancing over her shoulder with a warm smile. Morning, I mumbled, forcing a smile back. Mark was sitting at the table, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. He glanced up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. Sleep well? He asked casually. I nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. Yeah, you barely ate last night, Mom said, setting a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me. Feeling okay? I'm fine, I said, my stomach twisting at the thought of food. I avoided Mark as much as I could that day. After breakfast, I grabbed my book and headed to the hammock, where I knew Mom would spend most of her time. As long as I stayed close to her, I felt safe. Mark stayed busy fixing the shed, hammering away at some loose boards. But every so often I caught him watching me, his gaze lingering just a second too long. I pretended not to notice, burying my face deeper in my book, though I couldn't focus on the words. By mid-afternoon, the air was heavy with the promise of rain. Mom went inside to start dinner, leaving me alone on the porch. I glanced toward the shed, hoping Mark wouldn't notice I was by myself. Hey, Hannah. He froze at the sound of his voice. Turning slowly, I saw him leaning against the porch railing, wiping his hands on a rag. Hi, I said, forcing a polite smile. Got a second? He asked, his tone light, but his eyes too focused. Oh, sure, I said reluctantly, setting my book aside. He gestured toward the shed. I need your help holding something in place while I nail it down. Won't take long. My stomach churned, but I nodded. Okay. The shed smelled musty and damp, the air thick with the scent of wet wood. Mark had a workbench set up against one wall, cluttered with tools and nails. He handed me a piece of wood and gestured for me to hold it against the wall. Just like that, he said, positioning it carefully. As he hammered, I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, counting the seconds until I could leave. You're shaking, he said suddenly, his voice softer now. I looked up at him, startled. I'm not. You are, he insisted, setting the hammer down. Why are you so nervous around me? I'm not, I said quickly, stepping back. Mark studied me, his gaze heavy. You can talk to me, you know. If something's bothering you, nothing's bothering me, I said, trying to sound firm. I should go. Mom's waiting for me. Before he could respond, I hurried out of the shed, my heart racing. That evening I barely touched my dinner. Mom noticed, of course, but I waved it off, blaming the gloomy weather for my lack of appetite. She didn't press me, but I could feel her concerned eyes on me as I pushed the food around my plate. After dinner, I escaped to my room, locking the door behind me. I sat on the bed, clutching my phone, and texted my best friend, Megan. Me. Mark's acting weird again. I feel like he's watching me all the time. Megan. What happened? Me. He locked us in the garage yesterday. And today, he cornered me in the shed. Megan. Hannah, that's not okay. You need to tell your mom. Me. I can't. She'd never believe me. Megan, you don't know that. You have to say something. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Megan was right, but the thought of confronting Mom made my chest tighten. What if she didn't believe me? What if she thought I was overreacting? That night, the knock on my door came again. Hannah? Mark's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I froze, gripping the blanket tightly. What do you want? I called, trying to keep my voice steady. I just want to talk, he said. Please. There's nothing to talk about, I said, my voice trembling. There was a long pause, and then the sound of his footsteps retreating. I exhaled shakily, tears streaming down my face. The next morning, I told Mom I wasn't feeling well and spent most of the day in bed. She brought me soup and tea, her expression worried but gentle. Mark didn't come near me, though I could feel his presence in the house, a heavy shadow I couldn't escape. By the time the sun set, I had made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, waiting for the next time Mark would corner me. I needed to tell Mom, but the words still felt impossible to say. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. This time I didn't respond. Hannah, Mark's voice came, barely above a whisper. I know you're awake. I stayed silent, my chest tightening. After a long pause, he sighed and walked away. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. Mark's presence seemed to fill every corner, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I could hear him downstairs, humming to himself as he cleaned the kitchen. I stayed in my room, staring at my phone and willing myself to text Mom, to tell her what had been happening. But every time I started typing, I froze, the words feeling too big to send. Around lunchtime, Mom knocked on my door. Hannah? You okay in there? I opened the door crack, my stomach twisting. Yeah, just tired. She gave me a worried look. You've been hiding up here for days. Come down and eat something. Mark made lunch. The thought of sitting across from him at the table made my chest tighten. I'm not hungry, I said quickly. Honey, please, she said, her tone soft but firm. You can't avoid him forever. Her words felt like a slap. She had no idea how right she was. 15 minutes later, I was sitting at the kitchen table, picking at a sandwich while Mark sat across from me. Mom chatted happily, oblivious to the tension between us. You're awfully quiet, Hannah, Mark said, his voice light but probing. I shrugged, not meeting his eyes. Just tired. She hasn't been feeling well, Mom said, reaching over to touch my hand. Maybe you need more rest. I'm fine, I said quickly, pulling my hand away. Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. You should let me know if you need anything, Hannah. I'm always here to help. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. That afternoon, Mom decided to take a walk in the woods behind the house. She asked if I wanted to join her, but I shook my head, mumbling an excuse about needing to catch up on reading. Suit yourself, she said, grabbing her jacket. As soon as the door closed behind her, I felt the weight of Mark's presence. I was sitting on the porch swing, pretending to read, when he came outside. Mind if I join you? He asked, already sitting down beside me. I tensed, my heart pounding. Sure. For a moment, we sat in silence, the swing creaking under our weight. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken words. You remind me of someone I used to know, Mark said suddenly, his voice soft. I frowned, glancing at him. What do you mean? She was smart, beautiful, special, he said, his gaze locking onto mine. Just like you. I felt my stomach churn, my hands gripping the book in my lap. That's nice, I said awkwardly, standing up. I should go. Hannah, he said, his tone shifting. I froze, my back to him. You don't have to be scared of me, he said, his voice almost pleading. I didn't reply. Instead, I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. That evening, I called Megan. I don't know what to do, I whispered, my voice trembling. What happened this time? She asked, her tone sharp with concern. He said I remind him of someone special, I said, tears welling up in my eyes. And the way he looked at me. Megan, it's not normal. You need to tell your mom, she said firmly. I can't, I said, shaking my head. She'll think I'm making it up. Then tell someone else, she said. A teacher, a counselor, anyone. I wiped my eyes, my chest tightening. I'll think about it. Don't wait too long, she said. I'll wait too long, she said. This doesn't sound safe. Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. That night, I stayed in my room trying to block out the sound of Mark moving around downstairs. But around midnight, I heard the soft creak of footsteps outside my door. My breath caught, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Hannah! Mark's voice came, quiet and tentative. What? I called, my voice shaking. Can we talk? There's nothing to talk about, I said firmly. There was a pause, and then the sound of him trying the doorknob. Mark, stop! I shouted, panic rising in my chest. I just want to make things right, he said, his tone soft but insistent. Go away, I yelled, my voice breaking. For a long moment, there was silence. Then I heard his footsteps retreating. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. I needed to tell Mom. She was in the kitchen, making coffee, when I came downstairs. My hands were trembling and my heart was racing as I sat down at the table. Mom, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, her brow furrowing. What's wrong, sweetheart? I need to tell you something about Mark, I said, my throat tightening. Her expression shifted, a mix of concern and confusion. What is it? I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, Mark walked into the room. Good morning, he said, his tone cheerful. My stomach dropped, and I froze, the words dying in my throat. Morning, Mom said, glancing between us. Coffee's almost ready. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. I'm not hungry, I muttered, hurrying out of the room. That day, I made a plan. If I couldn't tell Mom directly, I'd write her a letter. I spent hours drafting it, carefully choosing my words, trying to explain everything without sounding crazy. When I finished, I folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope, tucking it under her pillow. As I crawled into bed that night, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this time, she'd understand. But deep down, I knew Mark wouldn't let this go without a fight. The morning came with a false sense of calm. The rain had passed, and sunlight filtered through the windows, casting golden patches on the floor. I sat in the kitchen, nervously stirring a bowl of cereal I had no intention of eating. Mom moved around the room, humming softly as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She hadn't said anything about the letter I'd left under her pillow, and I wasn't sure if she'd found it yet. Mark walked in a moment later, his presence instantly filling the space. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable, then smiled at Mom as if nothing were wrong. Morning, he said, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. Morning, she replied, her tone light and cheerful. I excused myself, muttering something about needing to finish my homework, and retreated to my room. By the afternoon, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I crept into Mom's room, my heart pounding as I checked under her pillow. The envelope was gone. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she'd read it, and was just waiting for the right time to talk to me. Or maybe she hadn't believed a word of it. The thought made my stomach twist. Later that evening, Mom announced that she was heading into town to pick up some groceries. I won't be long, she said, grabbing her purse. You two okay here for a bit? I opened my mouth to ask her to stay, but Mark spoke first. Of course, he said, his tone easy. Take your time. The door closed behind her, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stayed in my room, staring at my phone and willing time to move faster. I could hear Mark downstairs, the faint creak of floorboards as he moved around the house. And then the footsteps started up the stairs. I froze, my chest tightening as the sound grew closer. A soft knock came at my door. Hannah? Mark's voice was calm, almost gentle. I didn't answer. The doorknob rattled. Hannah, please, he said. We need to talk. No, we don't, I said, my voice trembling. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said, his tone still soft, but with an edge that sent chills down my spine. Go away, I shouted, backing away from the door. There was silence for a moment. Then, to my horror, I heard the faint sound of metal against the lock. I panicked, running to my desk and grabbing my phone. My fingers fumbled as I dialed Mom's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. The lock clicked open, and the door creaked as Mark stepped inside. Get out! I screamed, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Hannah, he said, holding up his hands as if to calm me. I'm not going to hurt you. You already are, I shouted, tears streaming down my face. His expression shifted, his brows furrowing in something that almost looked like hurt. I'm just trying to make things right, he said softly. By breaking into my room, I said, my voice trembling with anger. He took a step closer, and I backed away until my legs hit the edge of the bed. You've been avoiding me, he said. I can't stand it anymore. I care about you, Hannah. More than you realize. The words sent a wave of nausea through me. You're my stepfather, I said, my voice cracking. You're supposed to protect me, not this. I am protecting you, he said, his tone insistent. From a world that doesn't understand us. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're insane, I whispered. Before he could respond, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Hannah? Mark, Mom's voice called out. Mark froze, his jaw tightening as he turned toward the door. I seized the moment, darting past him and bolting down the stairs. Mom, I shouted, tears streaming down my face as I ran into her arms. She looked at me, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. What happened? I couldn't get the words out, sobbing too hard to speak. Mark appeared at the top of the stairs, his face carefully neutral. We were just talking, he said, his tone calm. She misunderstood. Mom's arms tightened around me. Misunderstood what? She demanded, her voice sharp. I finally found my voice, pulling away from her to look into her eyes. He's been doing things, saying things. It's not right, Mom. Her face paled, her eyes darting to Mark. What is she talking about? Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. Lisa, she's a teenager. She's emotional. She's making this into something it's not. I'm not, I shouted, my voice breaking. Mom looked between us, her face a mix of confusion, anger, and disbelief. Mark, she said, her voice trembling. Leave, now. He stared at her, his expression hardening. You're taking her side? Get out of my house, she said, her voice cold and firm. Mark hesitated, his jaw clenching, but eventually he turned and walked out the door. That night, Mom and I sat at the kitchen table, the weight of what had happened hanging heavily between us. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think you'd believe me, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. She reached across the table, taking my hands in hers. I'm so sorry, Hannah, she said. This should never have happened. The house felt different after Mark left. Emptier, quieter, but not in a comforting way. The shadows in every corner seemed longer, as if they held onto the weight of what had happened. Mom and I sat in the living room the next morning, the tension between us as heavy as the silence. She hadn't slept. It was written all over her face. Her usually bright eyes were dull, rimmed with red, and her hands shook as she held her coffee mug. I should have noticed, she said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Her voice was trembling, thick with guilt. I should have protected you. It's not your fault, Mom, I said softly, though part of me still wrestled with the anger I hadn't let out yet. She shook her head, setting the mug down and burying her face in her hands. I brought him into our lives. I trusted him. And he... Her voice broke, and she let out a shaky breath. I didn't know what to say. My own feelings were a mess, a storm of relief, sadness, and lingering fear. But seeing her like this made me push it all down. She needed me to be strong, even if I didn't feel like I could be. That afternoon she called the police. I sat in the kitchen, listening to her explain what had happened, her voice wavering but steady. I didn't hear every word, but I caught enough to know she was serious. She told them about the things Mark had said, how he'd entered my room without permission, how I'd been terrified. When she hung up, she turned to me. "They're going to issue a restraining order," she said. "He won't be allowed near us again." I nodded, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. A piece of paper wasn't going to erase the way I felt or stop the memories from replaying in my mind. Over the next few days, life felt surreal. Mom worked tirelessly to erase every trace of Mark from the house. She packed up his clothes, his tools, even the coffee mug he always used. She wanted him gone, and I couldn't blame her. But his absence didn't erase his presence. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside my window made my heart race. At night, I lay awake, staring at the door, half expecting to hear his voice again. I started avoiding the garage entirely. The memory of being locked in there with him was too fresh, too raw. A week later, Mom suggested we see a therapist. "I think it'll help," she said, her voice tentative. For both of us. I didn't want to talk about it, to relive it, but I agreed. I could see how much she was struggling, and if going to therapy would make her feel better, I'd do it. The first session was hard. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Avery, asked me questions I wasn't ready to answer. "What was the scariest part for you?" she asked gently. I hesitated, my throat tightening. "I guess the way he made me doubt myself," I said finally. "Like maybe I was imagining it, or overreacting." Dr. Avery nodded, her expression soft. "That's a normal reaction, Hannah. People like Mark are good at making you question your reality. But what you felt was real. And you were brave to speak up. Brave." The word felt foreign, like it didn't belong to me. Mom and I kept going to therapy, week after week. Slowly, I started to feel lighter, as if the weight I'd been carrying was lifting, piece by piece. Mom changed too. She stopped blaming herself, though I knew it wasn't easy for her. She started being more present, more attentive, as if she was trying to make up for the time she thought she'd failed me. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, she turned to me. "I'm so proud of you, Hannah," she said, her voice soft. "For what?" I asked, surprised. "For telling me," she said, "for being brave enough to stand up to him. I know it wasn't easy. I didn't know what to say." The tears came before I could stop them, and she pulled me into a hug. Months turned into a year, and life slowly returned to normal. I started sleeping through the night again, started laughing more, started feeling like myself. Mark's name became a ghost we didn't mention, a shadow we refused to acknowledge. He was gone, and we were better for it. One day, as I cleaned out my room, I found the letter I'd written to Mom, the one I'd left under her pillow. The words were faded, but the emotions behind them still felt fresh. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the letter, and for the first time, I felt proud of myself. I had spoken up. I had saved us. 2 years later, we moved to a new house, a fresh start in every sense of the word. The dacha was sold, along with all the memories it carried. As I unpacked boxes in my new room, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. For the first time in years, I saw strength in my reflection. What Mark had done would always be a part of my story, but it didn't define me. I had taken my life back, and that was something he could never take away.